Greetings, Resident Evil fanatics. It's getting dark out there. Be sure to watch your back, as strange things are just a glance away. I'm sure those strange things are just here to watch as well, and so be it. All entities are welcome. Welcome back to the Residents of Evil. Previously, we've spent 4 whole videos examining the seemingly endless trail of secrets within the RE Village trailers. As hinted at last time in our Baba Yaga analysis, another RE Village analysis is in the works, so watch out for that. But this time, something new is in the air. It's time for a literature analysis in regards to Resident Evil. Tonight, I want to examine a book that was released as a pre-order bonus for the 1997 Sega Saturn release of Resident Evil 1. This novella was originally written in Japanese by Hiroyuki Ariga, pupil of Resident Evil 2's writer. It was titled Biohazard: The Beginning. Soon after, an English translation was made available for a limited time called Resident Evil: The Book. This English transcript is extremely rare today, but thankfully, Project Umbrella uploaded a copy of all 7 chapters to their website. Huge thanks to them for offering a wealth of rare Resident Evil resources. They recently launched a Patreon page, so be sure to check that out. Now, given that this was only included as a Sega Saturn Collector's Edition bonus, it struggled to reach fans who experienced RE1 in any other way, unless they went out of their way to mail order it from Capcom's official website. On top of this prequel book is often overshadowed by the more accessible, complete literature in the Resident Evil lore, such as the RE novels by S.D. Perry. Just recently, I had the pleasure of reading through the S.D. Perry novelization of Resident Evil 1. This novel cements itself as perhaps the strongest and most immaculately polished version of RE1's narrative, even when compared to the 2002 GameCube remake. The entire first act of this book is packed with rich characterization and added backstory that remains exclusive to the novel. This first act follows the STARS briefing at the RPD, which takes place before Alpha Team embarks upon their rescue mission, and these early prequel scenes of S.D. Perry's novel are exactly what Biohazard: The Beginning focuses on. It embellishes upon these early events to yield a more organic arrival upon Alpha Team's departure via Chopper. It is essentially a prequel story written from Chris's first-person perspective. There are many shared scenes and plot elements between this prequel novel and S.D. Perry's novel, which we'll discuss in great detail. This is because S.D. Perry adopted characters from the prequel novella into her own novel and expanded on them even further. Let us begin. Brace yourself, as this one's going to get itchy and tasty. It begins. Chapter 1 starts with Chris awaking from a deep slumber late at night after downing some drinks in the evening. An annoying, inconsiderate sound blared in the air as Chris stirred in his bed, rudely awakened from his blissful dream. He'd grown anxious and fearful of these late-night calls ever since a 2 a.m. call from a state coroner informed him of his parents' death. His parents had been monstrously disfigured in a car crash, so much so that they could only be identified through dental records. This is one of the only pieces of backstory in all of the Resident Evil lore that mentions the Redfield parents at all, and from here on, online sources would use this as the cause of their death. Chris presumably raised Claire by himself thereafter, forming an unshakable bond between the two, as shown by their connection in the later entries. Chris groggily lifted the phone up to his ear, only to hear the familiar voice of a man who was 3 months dead and buried, or so he thought. The voice pleaded, "Chris, I swear it's me, Billy." Billy Rabbitson, a close friend to Chris since childhood, the two were often seen as an unlikely duo. While Billy excelled in his studies and rarely caused trouble, Chris found himself in the principal's office more times than he could remember. Being much less academically inclined, Chris enlisted in the Air Force after graduating, while Billy proceeded to study at MIT for the 4 years that followed. During this time, the two would have far fewer exchanges than previously, but Billy made sure to periodically send out letters, none of which did Chris actually respond to. After college graduation, Billy took up employment with Umbrella, and Barry recruited Chris for the STARS, landing the two back together in Raccoon City. That is, until Billy prepared to be relocated to Chicago via a corporate jet. Dialing back just 3 months from this late-night phone call, Billy's flight took off, but Umbrella's base quickly lost contact with the plane. The very next day, fragments of this same jet were discovered floating on the surface of the Great Lakes. Billy, along with 12 other passengers, had supposedly drowned in the icy cold lakes following the plane crash. Only to somehow dial up Chris 3 months later, which obviously left Chris dumbstruck. He forced out his questions, still baffled at the voice on the other end of the line. "Billy, if this is you, tell me how you survived the plane crash." "I wasn't on the plane when it crashed, Chris. 20 minutes after the company jet took off, it landed at a private airstrip in the next state. I was taken off the plane and driven right back to Raccoon City. It was necessary that I disappear," Billy insisted. Chris pressed on. A cloud of dreadful suspicion plagued his thoughts as Billy's responses continued to twist his mental image of Umbrella. "Chris, I know a secret, the most terrible secret you could imagine. The secret behind the chain of murders you're trying to solve. But not over the phone. The line might be tapped. I want to meet. Just you and I. The park near Victory Lake. You know, to the north of the city. Get there as quick as you can," Billy pleaded. "What's the rush?" Chris wondered out loud. "There are people trying to kill me, Chris," Billy begged. Chris nodded solemnly. "Okay, buddy, I'll be there in 35-40 minutes. He threw on the same day's outfit, emptied a fresh water bottle over his face, and started up his Shelby Cobra. Now, this phone call scene inspired a very similar series of events that S.D. Perry used in her novelization of RE1. In her version, Chris mentions being called by a panic-stricken Billy, who warns Chris that he and everyone around him is in great danger. In that novel, Chris and Billy arrange to meet at a diner, but Billy never shows up, and from that point forth, Chris suspects Umbrella of murdering him. As we uncover more, you'll notice more elements from this book that S.D. Perry incorporated into her novel. Chris then drove towards Victory Lake. It wasn't long before he found himself traversing the dark, curvy mountainside. As his arms grew tired from taking several sharp turns, a figure emerged onto the road. Chris swerved hard and slammed his Shelby Cobra into the railing at the road's border, putting the engine to a halt. Something irked him as he drew closer to the figure, as he noticed its bare, white bones jutting out of its skin, with many deep cuts plastered across its body. Its organs had ejected themselves from its body and lay exposed on the hard concrete beneath it, emitting a gut-churning stench. Chris resisted his urges of vomiting and approached the bleeding woman, taking her hand in his own. "Dear God, lady, what happened to you?" She muttered and trailed off. Still struggling to process the nightmare unfolding around him, more evil found him and decided to capitalize on his lower defenses. And that new evil approached, bathed in the moonlight. Chris registered this thing as a giant dog, also emanating a putrid odor of decay and death. He emptied an entire clip into the animal with his Beretta, shocked and frustrated that this thing practically laughed at his bullets. Completely unfazed, the creature howled and ran into the night, as if mocking Chris. After finding another eviscerated human body in the vehicle he spotted, Chris shakily returned to his car and reported back to headquarters with his radio. This is the only telling of the original Resident Evil in which Chris actually witnesses both zombies and a Cerberus before even flying out with the STARS Alpha team. In S.D. Perry's novel, Chris and Jill had their own hunches about what they call cannibal killers at the time, but neither of them actually witnesses these monsters until they land in the forest. And of course, this affects the events in the rest of the novella as well. Let's continue on. As the police sirens blared in the distance, he proceeded to search the rest of the park for Billy, but to no avail. Billy just wouldn't answer any of Chris's calls. All he found was a small gold necklace, one of two, that he'd gifted to Billy and his fiancée at their reception. At least he had some proof of his talk with Billy that night, and could hopefully use it to gain his team's support during their next meeting. He followed the sounds of sirens, and he was approached by the chief of police himself. His name here is Chief Brian Iron, with no S at the end, which is one spelling difference in this prequel, as opposed to the Chief Irons of S.D. Perry's novel and the games. Little jabs are thrown between Chris and Chief Iron here. This banter establishes the Chief's slimy, egocentric character with his little critique of Chris's performance that night. Iron's personality aligns closely with S.D. Perry's version of him, as well as his personality in the games. The prequel describes the Chief as a walking ego ego who planned to run for mayor, and Perry's novel labels him as a self-centered politician masquerading as a cop. All of these bits of characterization amount to a figure who is quite fittingly a spitting image of the corrupt yet seemingly untouchable nature of Umbrella itself. He aimed to cement himself as the face of a prosperous, growing Raccoon City by becoming its mayor, and operating as chief of police certainly granted him a head start. As Chris describes, Raccoon City started as a sleepy farming community until Umbrella fostered rapid growth through its tremendous influence on the city's job market. Half of the city's population became reliant on the jobs that Umbrella provided, as described in this prequel novella, which is similar to how 3/4 of the jobs were supplied by Umbrella in S.D. Perry's novel. Umbrella was the central economic power that ushered in the prosperity and growth Raccoon City had never seen, and Irons wanted in, so he jammed himself right into the money, seeing Umbrella's arrival as a sign that this position of esteem and authority was ripe for the taking. After his run-in with the chief, Chris gets approached by the deputy chief as well, who is unnamed in this book. Chris turns down the deputy's offer to ride into headquarters, as his nightmarish encounters had worn him out that night. In this small conversation, the deputy remains skeptical of Chris's claims regarding the creature he had witnessed. Pay attention to this theme of Chris's input being questioned and dismissed, as you'll see more of it in Chapter 3. The last thing to note here is that the deputy throws a sour look at Chief Iron, showing that even he couldn't stand the man's two-faced nature. While this deputy character isn't present in S.D. Perry's novel, this disgusted behavior is very reminiscent of how Wesker responds to Irons in Perry's novel. In her book, Wesker doesn't even bother to hide that glint in his eye, offering the absolute minimum in terms of compliance with Irons. Given this similar behavior, it's likely that this subtle interaction inspired Wesker's exchanges with Irons in Perry's novel. Both books imply a very forced, disingenuous relationship between Irons and his men. Chris ignores a couple of reporters trying to milk some story details from him, and proceeds to drive home, marking the end of Chapter 2. The next morning, Chris arrives at the RPD for a STARS meeting. This chapter offers a lot in terms of meaningful banter and character crafting for the Alpha team. It likely served as inspiration for the more consummate, tasteful RPD briefing scene in S.D. Perry's novel. In her novel, she does wonders to establish a rich wealth of added character backstory for each STARS member, highlighting their motivations in great detail. Her writing fosters a distinct police family type of dynamic, making the reader feel a sense of warmth and comfort. On the other hand, this prequel book actually puts a different spin on the exchanges between Captain Wesker and his subordinates, namely in terms of authority and the questioning of Wesker's authority, making this one of the most nuanced and alluring aspects of Biohazard: The Beginning. The best way to explain why this course of events stands out so boldly is to highlight the contrast between the RPD Briefing in Perry's novel and this prequel book. In her novel, each of the Alpha team members unconditionally obeys Wesker's orders. They want to intervene more directly with these alleged cannibal killers, but remain patient while Bravo team is sent out first. The only one to really challenge Wesker's orders in Perry's novel is Chris, as he is driven by the presumed death of Billy, and in that novel, no one really shares in Chris's hunches. Wesker dismisses his idea of investigating the Spencer estate directly, and Barry doesn't support Chris either. On the other hand, take a look at how these exchanges go down in Biohazard: The Beginning. In this prequel book, Wesker's character traits are quite similar, amounting to a cool, calculated captain whose mere presence demanded respect. But here, nearly every STARS member tries their hand at elevating their involvement in this murder case, and this is illustrated early on when Barry shouts, "I'm sick and tired of standing around doing nothing while a fiendish murderer stalks our citizens. I want a piece of the action, and so does every other member of STARS. Just ask him." In response to this fiery line, Wesker calmly rejects Barry's proposal as it would disobey the chain of command, only to be faced with more of the same. Joseph and Jill both shake their heads in disapproval as well. They eventually prompt Chris to recount his experience from last night, which ended in Wesker demanding a written report and trying to involve Chief Iron to escalate the case. So the entire dynamic of the STARS briefing is directed at backing up Chris's story and the Alpha team uniting against Wesker's restrictive orders, rather than dismissing Chris's speculations and obeying Wesker like in Perry's. Perry's. Novel. After this, the meeting is over. Jill pokes at Chris for more information as he leaves the room, which is the book's way of subtly putting these two in the spotlight, although Chris doesn't give her any more info. Annoyed, Jill hears faint sounds of children playing in the streets outside, remembering her motivations as a cop. Through several daring encounters, she became a hero in the eyes of the community's youth. But two young girls she had grown very fond of, Becky and Priscilla McGee, had been brutally eviscerated, presumably by the canine beast that Chris had encountered. This added backstory reaches even greater depths in S.D. Perry's novel, in which Jill finds meaning in retrieving the dog of the McGee girls after moving to Raccoon City. She had lived her entire life in her father's shadow as a thief, and after her father was imprisoned, she joined the STARS team as a way of reconnecting to the community. Her skills as an ex-thief are actually briefly incorporated later in this book and much more in S.D. Perry's novel, both books building on her title as the Master of Unlocking. Though she initially suffered through intense urges of relapsing into her old ways, Becky and Priscilla instilled a burning sense of responsibility in her as a STARS member. This is an excellent way for each of the books to inject a more personalized backstory for Jill. The use of the name Priscilla McGee in both books is actually a shout out to a Capcom employee who worked on the marketing material for RE2. Jill's added bits of backstory is where Chapter 3 comes to an end, and from this point forward, the chapters are more direct and eventful as the character relationships have been established. Rather than waiting on Wesker's orders, Chris acts on his own, heading out to the Umbrella Company building to dig up more information on Billy. Chapter 4 builds on Raccoon City's history as Chris approaches the Umbrella Company complex, expounding how it grew from a small town of 300,000 to a prosperous, booming city with a competitive education system, a highly acclaimed hospital, and many other grand assets. The Umbrella Company's immense financial contributions explain how these enhancements were even possible. Spencer likely chose this city in particular due to the small farming community being a relatively inexpensive area to invest in his projects. Chris makes his way to the receptionist of the complex, who directs him towards an Umbrella HR representative named Reginald Johnson. This man, and the receptionist for that matter, embody the synthetic corporate quality of Umbrella's public image, bearing a guise of automated cooperation when they are faced by Chris. Chris introduces himself as an executor of Billy's will to increase his chances of accessing Billy's private info, but it backfires when this man assumes that Chris, as an executor, should already have Billy's records via access to his family. Now, this little banter continues for a while as Chris expresses his concern of never burying Billy's body, but the man never offers any more info. Eventually, Chris realizes that he's not getting anywhere, so he announces that he's with the STARS and that he still doubts Billy's death. This finally gets the man to express some shock in his face and forces him to fall back on his automated voice. What's incredible about this last line Chris delivers is that he deliberately drops it to rattle the man's sense of stability. This is a recurring theme of Chris's character throughout this entire prequel book. He's gutsy, blunt, and driven by a strong sense of justice, even without the support of his superiors. Chapter 5 starts with Chris reading the evening newspaper, cringing at the story's cowardly depiction of himself, and shaking his head at how many times the reporter quoted Chief Iron. This is another recurring theme in the prequel novel. It does a solid job of progressively building up both Chief Iron and Umbrella as two-faced, self-righteous forces that hinder Chris's search for truth, and on top of these two forces is a captain who religiously enforces the chain of command, Albert Wesker, a man who would redirect Chris's interests towards Chief Iron, essentially trapping Chris between multiple faces of authority that defend Umbrella for their own reasons. Wesker does so for two reasons: for the money he is promised for erasing Umbrella's tracks, as was implied in RE1, and to gather combat data on how Umbrella's bioweapons fare against the STARS team, which is further explained in RE0. Chief Iron does so to edify his own public image and become the mayor of Raccoon City. Chris ignores 7 of 8 voicemails from reporters Wesker and Claire, only making a note to respond to his sister. His finger lingered on the answering machine as a sudden premonition slithered into his mind. Without hesitation, he fully loaded up his shotgun, but as he bent down to pick it up, 2 huge arms shot through the now empty window and seized his throat from behind. He reached for the closest thing that'd save him, smashing a bottle of Jack Daniels into the head of the beast behind him. Chris bolted outside with his shotgun and and heard the crunches of leaves, only to find Jill approaching his house through the surrounding brush. It turns out, Jill's motorcycle gave out on her way, and she decided to walk to Chris's place, but the book never clearly explains where she was going in the first place. It can be all but confirmed from her banter here that she was headed to Chris's place anyway, driven by her gut instinct that he knew more. While both S.D. Perry's novel and the original 1996 Resident Evil both imply that no one encounters a zombie before the mansion, the prequel novel features not one, but multiple encounters with T-virus-ridden creatures before Alpha Team departs. These juicy scenes help to build up Chris as a competent hero and pull him closer to Jill, and sensing her urges to seek justice for her beloved McGee girls, Chris complies, driving her to his next stop, straight to Billy's cabin. On the way to Billy's, Jill mentions how angry Chief Iron and Wesker have become in response to Chris's actions, namely his run-in with Reginald Johnson at the Umbrella Company. Apparently, Johnson complained to Chief Iron over the phone, probably because Chris had initially posed as an executor of Billy's will. Obviously, with Wesker being a control freak, he wanted to skin Chris alive, but even with this mess of unapproved actions, Chris puts the priorities of his superiors aside, again, in the interest of finding the cold, unfiltered truth regarding his friend. Well, let's just see how his search plays out. Chapter 6 begins with another tasteful addition to Jill's backstory. When she realizes Chris forgot the key to Billy's cabin, she cleverly uses her hairpin as a lockpick. This is the only reference to her implied ex-thief backstory in the prequel book, whereas S.D. Perry's novel builds Jill's entire character off of this concept, as mentioned earlier. Their banter here seems to mimic a brother-sister dynamic, with Jill playfully mocking Chris's little moments of incompetence. After turning up dry in their search for Billy or any clues, the two froze in terror. That pungent smell of death and decay had returned. A chorus of spine-chilling moans began to rise. Before Chris could even ready his guns, all hell broke loose. The door busted open, and 5 ravenous, walking corpses lurched forward. Chris and Jill grappled with the beasts, struggling to break free, when a human voice shouted, "Shoot them, Chris! They're not human, they're zombies." It was Billy. Chris finally managed to grab his shotgun, firing 2 blasts and disemboweling the monster. But this beast wasn't done yet. In a matter of seconds, its body had regenerated and its guts had sewn back together. Billy shouted, "Shoot them in the head, Chris. It's the only way to kill a zombie." Chris blasted again, decapitating the zombies that faced him and Jill, and knelt down to check on Jill until a paralyzing scream filled the cabin. As Billy's throat tore open and scarlet streams trickled down to his chest, Chris and Jill blew the tormentors back and off of Billy, but it was too late. "Hang in there, old buddy. You're going to make it. You gotta keep thinking that, Billy. You're going to make it," Chris cried. No use," Billy croaked. "Little time left. Must listen. I escaped." "Escaped? From where?" "Secret research lab. I was only one. Got away. We were forced to develop virus." "What kind of virus?" "T-virus. Changes humans into zombies." "Billy, you've got to tell us. How do we stop these things?" Chris demanded. Dark, crimson pools formed around Billy as he fought for his final words. Can't stop." Chris fought back his tears in deep sorrow for a moment, then closed his friend's troubled eyes and faced Jill. The 2 survivors made a break for the car, firing at any evil in their way. As they sped away from that nightmare, Chris and Jill were able to fall back on what they just discovered, especially now that Jill was a witness to Chris's story. The writing here is a little questionable, considering how quickly Chris seems to bounce back off of Billy's death. He even laughs with Jill in the car afterwards regarding Wesker's reaction to the news of the zombies. Considering how this book's foundation is rooted in Chris's inseparable connection with Billy, it's pretty unnatural to see him just shake off the unimaginable, otherworldly evils that had torn open Billy's throat. What's even worse is that Billy is hardly even mentioned later in the next and last chapter, and never does Chris reminisce about him in an emotional or otherwise rational manner. Unfortunate. Rest in peace, Billy. You will never be forgotten. Chapter 7 begins with Alpha Team in disarray. Wesker is noticeably stressed about something, and he starts silently pacing the office floor. In this prequel book, Richard Eichen is actually in the office as a member of the Alpha Team rather than Bravo Team, and serves as a young communications expert. Wesker informs Chris of Bravo's disappearance and shows him a diagram, a circle of several murders with a distinct structure in the middle. Wesker calls this the Old City Guest House, also known as the Spencer Mansion. After Chris and Jill share news of the T-virus turning humans into zombies, Wesker pretends to piece it all together as if he didn't know already. It's all just crazy enough to make sense. We're going to return in force to the place where Bravo vanished, he commanded. It's interesting to see this 1997 version of Albert Wesker before RE0 was released. His reaction to Bravo Team's disappearance makes sense, and Wesker is similarly frustrated with himself in S.D. Perry's novel. Keep in mind that his main goal at the time of this book's release is to erase Umbrella's tracks by reaching the lower labs of the Spencer estate before anyone else, and earn a huge sum of money from Umbrella. Since he knew the labs well, but not so much the mansion, he'd use both Alpha Team and Bravo Team to solve the mansion's cryptic puzzles and clear a path for him, and Bravo Team's scattering was not in his plans. In Resident Evil 0, Wesker has an added motivation when he leads Alpha Team to the mansion. He wants to gather combat data on how Umbrella's bioweapons fare against the Elite Stars team, which is a clever way to tie together the larger objective of Umbrella. After Wesker rounds up Alpha Team, which includes Rebecca and Richard in this book, they fly out directly to the Spencer estate. Chris describes the colossal building as a vine-covered hodgepodge of spires, turrets, and arched doorways. As the chopper's blades came to a slow, the team froze in response to an eerie, gut-churning shriek that echoed through the night. Redfield, Valentine, Wesker whispered. Either of you know what's making that sound? It's coming from the zombies, Captain. Chris locked eyes with Jill. They're letting us know they're here. Thank you for watching. Be sure to leave your thoughts of this prequel book in the comments and leave a like. If you enjoyed this analysis video on Resident Evil, the book, feel free to check out my channel. The link is in the description. I recently posted a full analysis video on the first Resident Evil novel by S.D. Perry, which uses many backstory elements from this prequel book. Once again, huge thanks to Project Umbrella for providing an English copy. Next time on Residents of Evil, another RE Village analysis is in the works, and there's more literature and files to dive into as well. This time around, we did not cover the George Trevor notes and the Shinji Mikami interview portions of the complete Saturn book, the true story behind Biohazard. Perhaps that can be arranged. Good night, and until next time, may Billy hold a special place in our hearts.